Transferring to a new school in the middle of the year was never easy, but I was hopeful this time would be different. The school was an old, imposing building with towering brick walls and ivy creeping up the sides, a place that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. On my first day, as I navigated the crowded hallways, I overheard a group of students talking in hushed tones by their lockers, glancing nervously over their shoulders. "Did you hear about the new transfer? Bet she doesn't know about room 108. Shoo, don't talk about it so loudly. You know what they say." Curiosity piqued. I slowed down, pretending to study my schedule as I eavesdropped. "They say if you get assigned to room 108, you're cursed," one of the students whispered. "Something about the room being haunted or whatever, but no one who's been there ever talks about it." "Why would they?" another student replied. "You've seen what happens. It's like they're different after, like something follows them." I moved on, pretending I hadn't heard, but their words stuck with me. Room 108, cursed room. I brushed it off as just another silly high school legend, the kind of thing meant to scare the new kid. But deep down, a part of me was intrigued. As luck would have it, room 108 was on my schedule. It was my assigned classroom for history, and I found myself standing in front of its door later that day, hesitating. The door looked just like any other, but something about it made my skin prickle. With a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the blinds drawn tightly over the windows, allowing only slivers of light to filter through. The desks were arranged in neat rows, and the air felt heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. A chill ran down my spine as I took a seat near the back, my eyes darting around the room. The class filled up slowly, students shuffling in quietly, avoiding eye contact. The atmosphere was tense, like everyone was holding their breath. When the teacher entered, she offered no pleasantries, launching straight into the lesson as if on autopilot. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to notice things. Small things. The flicker of the lights, the way the shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the room. The clock on the wall, ticking louder than it should. And then there was the feeling, the sensation of being watched. I tried to focus on the lesson, but it was impossible to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The teacher's voice droned on, but it was distant, muffled, as if I were hearing it through a thick fog. Suddenly, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, but the other students were all staring straight ahead, oblivious. "Hey, are you okay?" The voice startled me, and I looked up to see the girl sitting next to me. Her expression was one of concern, but there was something else in her eyes. Fear. "Yeah," I stammered, though I didn't believe it myself. "Just, this place is kind of weird, right?" She nodded slowly, leaning in closer. "Listen, don't stay here after school, okay? And don't let yourself be the last one out." Before I could ask her what she meant, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. The students filed out quickly, leaving me alone with the teacher, who watched me with an unreadable expression. I hurried out, her warning echoing in my mind. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences in room 108 became harder to ignore. Papers would rustle when no one was near them. The lights would flicker at odd intervals, and that feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing hour. Even the other students seemed on edge, exchanging nervous glances and leaving the room as quickly as possible once class was over. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just nerves about being the new kid. But then, one afternoon, I stayed behind after class to ask the teacher a question. The room emptied out, and I was alone. The teacher was at her desk, shuffling papers, and I approached hesitantly. As I opened my mouth to speak, the door to the classroom suddenly slammed shut, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. We both froze. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath visible in the cold air. The lights flickered wildly, casting the room in a strobe of light and shadow. And then the whispering began. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, filling the room with a chorus of voices. They were coming from all around us, from nowhere and everywhere at once, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The teacher's face went pale, and she whispered, "Get out, now." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, wrenching it open and stumbling into the hallway, gasping for breath. The whispers followed me, fading only when I was halfway down the corridor. I didn't look back. I didn't return to room 108 the next day. Instead, I made up an excuse to the administration, saying I needed to switch classes. They didn't ask questions, almost as if they expected it. But I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what was happening in that room, what the other students were too afraid to talk about. I found myself digging through old school records, searching for anything that could explain the strange phenomena. That's when I found it. A newspaper article from decades ago. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Local School. Teacher and students found dead in room 108. According to the article, a history teacher and several students had died in a freak accident during a fire. They were trapped inside room 108, unable to escape as the flames consumed the building. The cause of the fire was never determined, and the room was left untouched, rebuilt but never quite the same. Some said the spirits of the victims were still trapped there, reliving their final moments, reaching out to anyone who entered their domain. Others believed the room itself was cursed, forever tainted by the tragedy. I never went back to room 108, but the experience changed me. I learned that some places hold on to their past, that the dead don't always rest in peace. The whispers, the cold, the feeling of being watched, they were real, and they were the remnants of a tragedy that had never truly ended. And now, every time I pass that part of the school, I can still feel it. A presence waiting, watching just beyond the door. High school wasn't exactly a welcoming place for someone like me. I preferred to keep to myself, drifting through the day without drawing attention. The others didn't notice me, and I didn't mind. It was easier that way, less complicated. But that changed when the notes started appearing. It was a few weeks into the new semester when I found the first one, tucked into the pages of my textbook during English class. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a piece of paper left behind by the previous owner of the book. But when I unfolded it, my heart skipped a beat. Written in neat, almost elegant handwriting were the words, "I see you." I looked around the classroom, but no one seemed to be paying me any attention. The teacher was droning on about Shakespeare, and my classmates were either half asleep or scribbling in their notebooks. I crumpled the note and stuffed it into my pocket, telling myself it was just a prank, a harmless joke. But the notes kept coming. Every day, I'd find a new one, slipped into my locker, taped to my desk, or even tucked into my backpack when I wasn't looking. "I'm watching you. You can't hide from me. You're never alone." At first, I tried to ignore them, but the messages grew more frequent, more personal. They mentioned things only someone close to me would know, details about my routine, my habits, the routes I took to and from school. The notes seemed to follow me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria, choosing instead to hide in the library or an empty classroom. I avoided eye contact, constantly on edge, wondering who could be watching me so closely. But no matter where I went, the notes found me. One day, I decided to stay late after school to finish a project. The building was eerily quiet, the hallways deserted, the usual noise and bustle gone. It should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt like the walls were closing in on me, the silence pressing down like a weight. As I worked in the empty classroom, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, I heard something, a soft rustling sound, like paper being crumpled. I froze, my heart pounding, and slowly turned toward the door. It was slightly ajar, just enough to see the darkened hallway beyond. Cautiously, I got up and walked over, peering into the hallway. Nothing, just empty lockers and shadows stretching along the floor. I let out a shaky breath, convinced I was imagining things, when I felt it. A cold breeze against the back of my neck, like someone breathing down my spine. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the same empty classroom, the same flickering lights. But on my desk, where there had been nothing a moment before, lay another note. This one was different. It wasn't a threat or a taunt. It was a single question, written in the same neat handwriting. Why don't you ever smile? My blood ran cold. Whoever was doing this wasn't just watching me. They knew me, knew my thoughts, my feelings, my loneliness. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't before. The feeling of being watched was no longer just paranoia. It was real, and it was closing in. Over the next few days, my anxiety turned to fear. I could barely focus in class, constantly glancing over my shoulder, searching for the source of the notes. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find them. I started to notice small things. Shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, footsteps echoing behind me when no one was there, the feeling of being followed even in broad daylight. I became obsessed with finding out who was tormenting me. I started hanging back after school, trying to catch them in the act. But every time I thought I was getting close, they would slip away, leaving only another note behind. One evening, I decided to confront them once and for all. I stayed late again, this time in the art room, where I could watch both the door and the windows. I waited, my nerves frayed, every sound making me jump. Then, I heard it. A faint creak, like someone stepping on an old floorboard. I held my breath, my eyes locked on the door. Slowly, it began to open, inch by inch, and I saw a shadowy figure standing just outside, half hidden in the darkness. I didn't wait to see who it was. Panic took over, and I bolted, running through the hallways as fast as my legs could carry me. The school was a maze of twisting corridors and dead ends, but I didn't stop. I could hear footsteps behind me, quick and light, like someone running right on my heels. I burst out of the school into the cold night air, not daring to look back. I kept running, not caring where I went, just wanting to get as far away as possible. When I finally stopped, I was out of breath, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I was standing near the edge of the woods that bordered the school grounds, the trees looming like dark sentinels against the sky. I turned around, expecting to see my stalker emerging from the shadows. But there was no one there, just the silent, empty school, the windows dark and foreboding. I almost laughed in relief, thinking maybe I had imagined the whole thing, when I heard a soft voice behind me. "You're faster than I thought." I whipped around, and there they were, a figure stepping out from behind a tree, their face obscured by the darkness. But even in the dim light, I recognized them. It was one of my classmates, someone I barely knew, someone who had never stood out to me before. You've been following me?" I stammered, disbelief and fear warring in my mind. They stepped closer, their face finally coming into view. There was a strange smile on their lips, a look of satisfaction in their eyes. "I've been watching you," they said calmly. "You're always so alone, so sad. I thought I could help you, make you see that someone cares. But the notes, why would you do that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Because you needed to wake up," they replied, almost as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You were invisible even to yourself. I made you see that you're not alone, that someone is always watching." I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were frozen. The reality of what they were saying, of how deeply they had invaded my life, my mind, was too much to process. They reached out a hand, as if to comfort me, but I recoiled. "Stay away from me," I whispered, backing away slowly. Their smile faded, replaced by a look of hurt. "You don't understand," they said softly. "I was trying to be your friend." With that, they turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving me standing there, my mind reeling. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was a deep, gnawing fear. The kind that doesn't go away, that sticks with you, makes you question everything, everyone. The next day, they were back in class, sitting at their desk like nothing had happened. No one else seemed to notice anything different, but I couldn't look at them without feeling sick. They never left another note, never spoke to me again. But the damage was done. I knew now that the worst monsters weren't the ones in horror stories or nightmares. They were the ones who hid in plain sight, wearing the faces of the people you passed by every day. And sometimes the scariest thing wasn't being alone. It was realizing that you weren't. I've always been the kind of person who needs to know how things work. If there's a puzzle to solve, I'm the first to dive in, no matter how strange or unsettling it might be. That's why, when I first heard about the locker, I couldn't just let it go. It started as a rumor, passed around in hushed tones between classes. There was a locker, they said, that shouldn't be opened. A locker that, according to school legend, was haunted. They called it Locker 217. The story went that years ago, a student had disappeared from school, vanishing without a trace. The only clue left behind was their locker, 217, which no one could open after they went missing. The lock would jam, the door wouldn't budge, and anyone who tried to force it open would hear a strange whispering, as if the missing student was trapped inside, trying to communicate. Most people dismissed it as just another silly ghost story, something to scare the freshmen. But I was intrigued. I had to see it for myself. One afternoon, when most of the students had cleared out, I made my way to the older, less used section of the school where Locker 217 was supposed to be. The hallways were dimly lit, the lockers dented and rusted, a stark contrast to the rest of the school. Felt like stepping back in time. I found the locker easily enough. It looked like any other. Faded blue, the number 217 barely visible under layers of chipped paint. But as I stood in front of it, I felt an undeniable pull, a curiosity that was almost painful in its intensity. I had to know what was inside. I reached out, gripping the lock, and tried to turn it. It didn't move. I tried again, harder this time, but it was as if the lock had rusted into place, unyielding. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it, a faint whispering, like someone murmuring just behind the metal door. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't just the wind or the hum of the lights. It was a voice, low and indistinct, but definitely there. I leaned in closer, pressing my ear to the cold metal, and the whispering grew louder. "Help me!" I jumped back, my blood running cold. The voice was desperate, pleading. I looked around, expecting to see someone nearby, but the hallway was empty. I was alone. Couldn't get the voice out of my head. Over the next few days, it haunted me, a constant background noise that I couldn't ignore. I found myself returning to the old hallway, standing in front of Locker 217, listening. The voice was always there, whispering the same plea over and over, "Help me," but there was nothing I could do. The locker wouldn't open, and I didn't dare try to break it open with tools, fearing what might happen if I did. Instead, I began digging into the history of the school, searching for any information about the missing student. The records were sparse, but I found enough to piece together a rough timeline. The student's name was Daniel, a junior who had been known for keeping to himself. One day, he just didn't show up for school, and after a few weeks, everyone assumed he had run away. The investigation into his disappearance was brief and inconclusive. But what caught my attention was a small detail buried in the report. The last time anyone had seen Daniel was near his locker, number 217. The more I dug, the more questions I had. Why had the case been closed so quickly? Why hadn't the locker been searched? It was as if everyone had just wanted to forget about him, to move on. But I couldn't move on. I had to know the truth. I started spending more time by the locker, trying to make sense of the whispers, hoping they would reveal something I could use. But the more I listened, the more the voice seemed to fade, as if it were slipping away. That's when I realized what I had to do. One night, long after everyone had gone home, I snuck back into the school. The building was eerily silent, the only sound my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. I made my way to Locker 217, flashlight in hand, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. The locker looked even more ominous in the dark, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I could feel the fear creeping in, but I pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. I had brought a small toolkit intending to pick the lock, but as I knelt in front of the locker, I hesitated. The whispering had returned, but it was different this time, softer, almost apologetic. "Please don't." I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I reached for the lock. But before I could touch it, the lights overhead flickered and went out, plunging the hallway into complete darkness. My heart skipped a beat, and I fumbled with my flashlight, nearly dropping it. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam of light illuminated the locker, and I saw something that hadn't been there before. A message scratched into the metal surface, barely visible in the weak light. "Don't open it." I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Had someone else left that message, or had it always been there, hidden in the worn metal? The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as if the voice was trying to tell me something important, something I wasn't meant to know. But I was already in too deep. I had to see this through. Ignoring the warning, I began working on the lock, my hands steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The locker resisted at first, but after a few tense minutes, I heard a click, and the door swung open with a creak. Inside, the locker was empty. No books, no personal items, nothing. Just a hollow metal box. But the whispering hadn't stopped. If anything, it had become louder, echoing off the walls, filling the entire hallway with that desperate, pleading voice. "Help me!" I stepped closer, shining the flashlight inside, and that's when I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible handprint on the back wall of the locker, smeared in what looked like dust or grime. But it wasn't a normal handprint. The fingers were too long, too thin, as if whoever had left it wasn't entirely human. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal, and the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I suddenly felt a presence behind me, something dark and cold, hovering just out of sight. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen looming over me, was impossible to shake. I backed away from the locker, my mind racing, trying to understand what had just happened. The handprint, the whispers, they weren't just the remnants of a tragic disappearance. They were a warning. I slammed the locker shut, locking it again as quickly as I could, and ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the school, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, the reality of what I had uncovered sinking in. Daniel hadn't just disappeared. He had been taken, pulled into something far darker and more sinister than anyone had imagined. And whatever had taken him was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake I almost had. The next day, I went back to school, trying to act like everything was normal. But I couldn't stop thinking about Locker 217, about what might have happened if I had opened it fully, if I had ignored the warnings. I knew one thing for sure: I would never go near that locker again. But some nights, when I'm alone, I can still hear the whispering, faint and distant, as if it's following me, just waiting for the right moment to draw me back in.